Are we ready to roll? All right. Well, welcome back, everyone, both here in Berkeley and on the live stream. Our next speaker has worn several hats during her career that can best be described, I think, in two words: inspiring leadership. Professor Jane Lubchenco is a distinguished university professor at Oregon State University, where she now investigates the interactions between environment, human well-being, and sustainability. A marine ecologist by training, Jane's early research on the ecology of rocky intertidal communities produced important ecological benchmarks. But it was 20 years ago that I noticed her leadership emerging as president of the Ecological Society, where she led the Sustainable Biosphere Initiative, which was an important step in recognizing the need to integrate basic and applied science to produce solutions for environmental problems, a theme she continued as president of the American Association of Advancement of Science. Jane then served as Undersecretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmospheres and the Administrator for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, from 2009 to 2013. There, she confronted challenges ranging from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill to crafting national ocean policy to strengthening NOAA's scientific capacity. She's, I'm happy to say, made the re-entry back into academia at Oregon State again. And today she'll talk to us about themes close to her heart, her talk entitled Seize the Day. Welcome, Jane.
Hello, everyone. My sincere thanks to Steve and the entire team of folks, students and faculty and administrators here at Berkeley, but also to the gifted leaders, scientists, explorers, and storytellers at the National Geographic Society, and indeed to all of the sponsors for bringing us together and launching what I hope will be a centennial celebration worthy of the vision that created it. I wish to give special thanks and recognition to the wonderful public servants at the National Park Service in particular, but also all federal employees that work in parks and protected areas, whether they're state or federal. Those are really unsung heroes, and having seen from the inside how very little respect public servants often get from members of Congress and the public, I want you to join me in a round of applause for our wonderful federal employees, public servants that work so dedicated each and every day for all of us. So NPS folks, thank you. We come together in Berkeley to celebrate a remarkable legacy and the visionary leaders who had America's best idea and then proceeded to put it into action. Imagine leaving special places alone, not, quote, improving them or, quote, making them useful. Imagine parks for all to enjoy, not just royalty or the wealthy. Imagine a federal agency to watch over special places and learn from them. These were truly outrageous ideas when they were initially proposed, maybe even as outrageous as some of Ed Wilson's proposals. We also come together to take stock of what has changed in the 100 years since the National Park Service was created. What has changed in the parks, what has changed in society, and what has changed in science. A lot in each of those. And finally, we come together to consider how we should do justice to the parks we have grown to appreciate as laboratories, as refuges, and as a reflection of our better selves. What indeed is our bold vision for the future? National parks are some of America's most valued treasures, the creation of parks initially reflected the wisdom of a few visionaries who believed that protecting the nation's still wild places was not only important, but imperative. Through time, Americans have come to embrace the concept of protecting special places, parks, monuments, wilderness areas, reserves, and sanctuaries, so much so that too many visitors often pose a serious challenge to the health and the future of many parks, especially iconic national parks. As the nation celebrates the first 100 years of the National Park Service, addressing threats to existing parks is an obvious, although far from easy, challenge to rally around. Climate change, crowds, use conflicts, deferred maintenance, invasive species, air, water, and noise pollution, and the connections to the larger ecosystems outside of those protected places. Make no mistake, addressing those big challenges is vitally important for the future. But I see a bolder, parallel opportunity, one that incorporates new knowledge and adapts it for the next century, one that reflects the fact that 2/3 of the area of the United States is in the ocean, and about 2/3 of the world is ocean. Recognizing that Americans and people around the world benefit directly from healthy oceans, and that only 6% of the ocean under U.S. jurisdiction is strongly protected, and less than 1% of the global ocean is strongly protected, I propose a bold focus on the blue to complement the first century's focus on green. It's time, I believe, for a new vision for a new century, expanded and more effective protection for the salty and wet and still wild places underwater to complement our green and brown special places. To date, we've only dipped our toes in the water of ocean conservation. Now's the time to take the plunge and propose a new public vision that embraces the ocean under U.S. jurisdiction as equally worthy of protection. A vision that puts blue on a par with green and that recognizes the interconnections among the blue and the green and people. Recognizes that people depend on both of those and they are all interrelated. I don't need to remind this audience that fish are wildlife too. So too are sea stars and squid, corals and crabs. This vision is about blue parks, but it's not limited to just the National Park Service. Just as climate service will require lots of partners and lots of players, achieving adequate protection in the ocean will also require multiple partners and multiple players. Now, science has provided a wealth of information, a wealth of insights to guide this vision. We distinguish in the ocean world between two major types of protection. One is marine reserves, which are fully protected, no extractive activities or destructive activities allowed, and the larger category of marine protected areas, which can mean pretty much anything. Sometimes a lot of extraction is allowed, sometimes there's partial protection, sometimes fully protection. And the scientific evidence on this is really clear, that when you fully protect areas from any extractive or destructive activities, you have very significant benefits to biodiversity and more. So what happens when ocean areas are fully protected? This is an analysis that was done surveying all the scientific studies that have been done around the world in fully protected no-take areas. And we see that on average, there is huge change inside an area once it is protected. The average individual size increases, the total amount of biomass increases, things become more abundant, and they become more diverse. Now, much of that bounty spills over, but full protection really brings much greater ecological benefits than does partial protection. Slightly differently from what happens on land, most marine species, as young, either propagules or larvae or juveniles, disperse through the water to other places away from where their parents are. And because they disperse, even depleted areas can recover if there are source propagules in the general vicinity. Some of that bounty within the protected areas also spills out over the edges into adjacent waters, and in many cases can help recover depleted fisheries outside an area. This is what Enrique Sala calls fish banks, reserves serving as a bank to provide interest that then spills over to adjacent areas. This figure shows an analysis that was done showing this dispersal distance with, at the top here, seaweeds, and the middle panel is invertebrates, and the lower panel is fishes. And this shows on a log scale the average distance traveled by those three different categories. And so you can see that, in fact, there is quite considerable distance traveled by many young, although it varies obviously from species to species. Another finding from our scientific information is that protecting very large-bodied individuals, the large fish or invertebrates, is really key to recovering depleted populations and also to countering the evolutionary pressure that has come about because fishermen tend to focus on the large-bodied species. In so doing, there has been evolutionary pressure in many species for reproduction at smaller and smaller sizes. And so creation of no-take reserves and networks of no-take reserves can help counter that evolutionary pressure that has been documented for many species. Another relevant finding is that networks of marine reserves can provide many of the benefits of single, very large reserves, but still allow some extraction between the protected areas. And to illustrate those two concepts, this is a figure that shows the reproductive output of different sized individuals of the vermilion rockfish, a species that's just right off the coast here. And if you compare on the left, a 14-inch rockfish to the one on the right, 26-inch rockfish, the first produces around 150,000 young. The larger rockfish, the largest one shown there on the right, produces 1.7 million young. And so allowing fish, and the same is true for invertebrates, to get a little bit larger brings hugely more reproductive benefit. Connectivity among those areas that are protected is really critical. Many of those species, not only do the young disperse, but in many populations, in many species, juveniles occupy a different habitat from the adults. And you see here a life cycle of one particular species and the different habitats that it moves across. And so when we think about protection in the ocean, we really need to take into account the different types of habitats that are occupied not only by a single species, but by a series of species. And therefore, protecting very large areas is important, or if one is designing networks, protecting portions, representative portions of the different habitats within an area is key to successful production. Properly spaced and sized networks can provide many of the benefits of huge reserves, but also allow some extraction in between. And here you see the set of fully protected and partially protected marine reserves and marine protected areas around the Channel Islands, again off the coast here, where in red you see the protected areas that are in state waters and federal waters. This is truly a network of no-take areas that was designed explicitly to capture that connectivity of juveniles and adults so they can essentially hopscotch from one reserve to another. Additional findings from the wealth of scientific information that we have from the last couple of decades is that connectivity among protected areas will be key as the climate continues to change. And as all of you are well aware, climate change is really introducing some very serious complications to protected areas that stay in one place as the climate is changing. In the ocean, we can take advantage of that in having networks and facilitating movement and protecting different parts of the ecosystem. Connectivity among protected areas will also be key as the climate continues to change, and large, fully protected areas have been shown to be more resilient to environmental changes, such as bleaching from warmer water temperatures or invasive species, than are smaller or non-protected areas. So in reality, very large areas are ideal, but they are not always politically and socially feasible. Reserves, we've also learned, can help restore significant ecological balance by restoring the interactions among species. In this particular case, again from the Channel Islands, fishing pressure on lobster, shown in the right panel here, has reduced the size of the lobster populations. That relieves pressure on the urchins, one of the primary food sources of lobsters. Urchins are very, very abundant, and they in turn eat up most of the kelp. On the left-hand panel, where a marine protected area, a fully protected marine reserve is in place, that balance is restored, and we have now lush kelp forests that provide the habitat for a wealth of other species, not just the 3 trophic levels that you see here. So we've seen significant recovery in the Channel Islands as a result of creation of these no-take areas, in particular networks of no-take areas that are connected by the movement of juveniles and adults. Large fully protected areas often do experience bleaching, although they tend to be more resilient. They tend to bleach less, and they tend to recover more quickly from bleaching events. So clearly, from what I've said, there's a wealth of scientific information that tells us that fully protected marine reserves are very, very important for biodiversity and for ecosystem functioning. They bring a wealth of benefits to the areas that are protected, and some of that bounty spills out over to outside the area. So the real conundrum here is, despite all these benefits, why is it that we have such very, very low levels of protection in the ocean? Now, the figures that you saw earlier, 3% of the ocean being protected is any kind of protection, and less than 1% of that is fully protected. So why is that so low, and what can be done about it? It's relevant to know that scientists think on the order of between 20 and 30% is probably the minimum amount that needs to be protected. So that's a far cry from where we are now. So why is so little of the ocean protected? I think there are 2 major reasons for this. One is that there's very little public awareness about the need for protection, the opportunities, and the benefits of protection. So, oceans are out of sight, out of mind, and for many people, they actually think, when surveyed, that much larger fraction of the ocean is protected than is reality. The second major reason, though, is that different types of extractive users, be they fishermen, oil and gas companies, mining companies, generally vigorously oppose creation of any no-take areas for pretty obvious reasons. So we have a real conundrum here. Little protection, a huge need for a lot more, little public awareness, and very active antagonistic attitude toward creating any areas. So one of the challenges with this is that the people in this park and science equation are really, really important. And when David Quammen, who was mentioned in the opening ceremonies last night, very eloquent science writer, focused on parks in an earlier issue of National Geographic magazine, He said our national parks are only as good, only as good as the intensity with which we treasure them. And it's that treasure them, it's the wanting of them, it's the wanting to protect them and keep them healthy that is really key to solving this dilemma. So we have a conundrum, but in fact the good news is the tide is beginning to turn. Public awareness is beginning. It's not where it needs to be, but it is beginning. Google has embraced this concept and is helping to spread awareness through technology. Artists are becoming engaged in ocean issues and raising awareness about the importance of dealing with some of the pollution from land, but also the need for protecting areas. And governments are beginning to take action. Just this last summer, President Obama proclaimed what at the time was the largest strongly protected network of marine protected areas in the world on the Pacific Remote Islands Marine National Monument. And just last week, the United Kingdom Britain announced the largest marine reserve in the world around Pitcairn Islands, an area that's approximately the size of France and Germany. Now, those sound really big and really important, and they are big and important, but they are still a drop in the bucket compared to what's really needed. In addition to those things, though, scientists and NGOs are working actively to address the needs of not only parks, but people and parks. And it's this triumvirate that I really want to draw your attention to. These three are interconnected, and we need to think about them as interconnected. Some of those activities are resulting in fishery reforms that are addressing the working seascape areas outside of reserves that are critically important to helping protect biodiversity and health of oceans, as well as to food security for the future. Creating conditions for fishermen to support no-take areas can be achieved in giving them secure access with rights-based fishery approaches, especially spatially explicit territorial user rights fisheries, can really change this equation. And protecting biodiversity is beginning to be seen by many, whether it's biodiversity on land or in the ocean, as a moral issue. So all of those things that are changing are beginning to make a difference. And as indeed we reflect on the 100 years of the creation of the National Park Service, and we think about all of the iconic species that are currently protected in national parks, it's really incumbent upon us that we acknowledge both the plethora of challenges to those parks, to acknowledge that we come armed with strong science and the ability to protect, produce more useful knowledge, and also be more prepared to engage with society around some of the very real issues of conflict that have arisen not only with parks, but outside of parks, especially in the immediate areas surrounding parks. So we propose, as we celebrate this centennial, a new vision for parks, a new vision that has interdependent science, parks, and people, on land and in the ocean. I'm suggesting to you that now is the time for blue parks too. And I leave you with this thought that we should seize the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay.
Thank you.
That was wonderful.
Good.
Let's mosey over. Thank you very much, Jane. That was inspiring. So you told us about marine protected areas and marine reserves, right, as two different kinds of forms of protection or management of these marine areas. And how does that relate to sort of the idea of parks and protected areas and working landscapes? And how do you see these pieces fitting together in the conservation strategy?
Clearly, the type of protection in all the different categories of protected areas that we have is a continuum. It's not, just two categories. We tend to simplify. Parks allow some extractive activities. Wilderness areas do not, for example. In the ocean, marine protected area is really the catch-all category, but it can mean so many different things that almost doesn't mean anything at all. And some of those areas are lightly protected, some are not enforced and are just what people call paper parks. So much of my focus has been squarely on these no-take marine protected areas, marine reserves, for the very reason that that is the strongest kind of protection that brings the most ecological benefit, both for biodiversity as well as restoring ecosystem functioning, and that in turn has consequences for people. So there are similar issues on land and in the ocean with respect to a gradient of types of protection. And in my view, we need lots of the fully protected areas, but we also need other areas that are lightly used, and then ones outside that are more fully used. So we need to think not just in a binary fashion, nothing versus all, but really a continuum of use.
Okay. A lot of our marine protected areas are in near shore. But the ocean is blue, as you said, and it's big. And a lot of it are international waters. How important is protection in the international waters? How do we achieve that?
So international waters, commonly called the high seas, represents about 2/3 of the ocean. So it's a lot of what's out there. Most countries' jurisdiction goes 200 nautical miles away from the coast, and that's where most of the protected areas are. That's for a very simple reason. Countries have authority to make decisions about protection within their own exclusive economic zones, but no one has authority to do something that is fully protected outside of those areas in the high seas. So until very recently, this has been a real problem, especially since the type of vision that I'm calling for will really require significant attention to the high seas as well as the areas within countries' boundaries. Two, I think, things shed light on this. One, a recent analysis of fisheries in high seas and coastal areas has suggested that about 40% of the species that are most important commercially are fished both in the high seas and in countries' exclusive economic zones. An analysis by Crow-White and Chris Costello, two economists, has suggested that in fact, if we close the high seas to all commercial fishing, a really radical idea, that in fact would bring very significant economic and environmental benefit, because many of those species are also fished in species in countries' EEZs, and they're cheaper to fish there. You don't have to go as far, you use less gas. So those fisheries would benefit significantly because there's less pressure on the high seas and because it's cheaper. So there's economic benefit, there's environmental benefit, and that's one of these real big, bold ideas that I think is attracting a lot of interest and a lot of attention. The other thing that's happened recently is that the United Nations in January decided to really take seriously and create a working group with the mandate of proposing recommendations for how to deal with biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. BBNJ is the UN lingo. Biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. And that means the high seas. How should we be thinking about it? How should we be dealing with it? Acknowledging that it is really important to having healthy oceans globally, but right now there is no real mandate to tackle that. The Pew Charitable Trust created the Global Ocean Commission, an international group of leaders to really think and make recommendations about how to deal with the high seas. There are a series of pretty bold recommendations coming out of that as well. So in short, or in sum, that wasn't short, but in sum, high seas are a really important part of the equation. We've dealt with them inadequately. We need to do so.
I've got to ask you this one because it bothers me sometimes. Maybe it doesn't bother you. Ocean acidification. How are we going to deal with it? Should we be losing sleep about it?
Ocean acidification is a major problem. It's going to be an even bigger problem down the road. Oceans are already 30% more acidic than they were at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The reason that they are more acidic is that oceans have been absorbing much of the carbon dioxide that we have been putting into the atmosphere. And when oceans absorb CO2, the chemistry of the ocean changes, oceans become more acidic. That has very real consequences for anything that makes a shell or a skeleton, everything from phytoplankton to corals, the small pteropods, the little marine snails that are important food source for salmon and mackerel, urchins, crabs, oysters, mussels, all of those are made of shells or skeletons with calcium carbonate. Because of the changes in ocean chemistry that go along with ocean acidification, it's harder for many of those species to make their hard parts, and those hard parts erode more quickly. We don't fully understand all the ramifications for that. We also know that ocean acidification has other impacts, for example, in affecting how fish smell. Everyone knows how important smell is for salmon to return to their natal streams. Well, fish also use smell to detect predators, for example. And the little Nemo fish, clownfish that live in anemones, use smell to tell when their predator fish are around, and when they do, they dive down into an anemone. If you put them in a laboratory situation that mimics the ocean chemistry 100 years from now, what you find is that, in fact, those fish get very confused, those Nemo fish, and instead of swimming away from their predators, they swim toward them. Not a good idea. So we're just beginning to understand all of the consequences of ocean acidification and the other ocean chemistry changes that go along with it. We have every reason to believe there will be some very serious consequences of this, and it provides yet another significant reason to reduce carbon emissions as fast and as quickly as soon as possible.
All the stuff I like to eat disappearing. I suspect I'm not alone there. Okay, last question for you from the audience. What advice do you have for scientists and professionals as a best way to engage the public that's becoming increasingly detached from the natural world?
I think it's really important for kids to spend some time in the out-of-doors. That's not a novel concept, but it's one that I think is really, really important. Creating opportunities for them to get their hands dirty, to get in the ocean, to get in lakes and streams, to really play in the natural world like Ed Wilson described he did when he was a kid and that I did when I was a kid. That's really, really important. But so too is making scientific information accessible to not only kids but to their parents and to all of the adults. Many people think that science is just a big body of dry facts and figures, and it's not something they can understand. I'll tell you a quick story. When I was at NOAA and we were dealing with the Gulf oil spill, the president asked the vice president to go to the Gulf and meet with fishermen and tell them what we were doing to protect seafood from oil by closing areas to fishing, by testing the seafood to make sure that none of it would be contaminated, what we were doing in many different regards. The vice president said to the president, "I'm happy to go to the Gulf, but I don't really know much about oil spills or fisheries, so I need somebody to brief me on the way down there." So his people contacted my people, and I flew on Air Force 2 with the vice president to the Gulf and briefed him on the way down there and described how oil is actually very nasty, toxic stuff, that if it contaminates seafood, that can be a real problem for people. They're known carcinogens, but that things like fish can metabolize oil and process it and no longer be contaminated. Things like shrimp and crabs can metabolize the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons that are of concern, but they do so more slowly. Other seafood, like oysters, can't do so at all. And I was describing these different results and what we were doing. And he stopped me partway through and he said, "I thought you were a scientist." And I said, "I am," thinking, what the heck is he getting at? And he said, "But I just understood everything you told me." And I thought, wow, what an incredible condemnation of science that is. Think of how many times the vice president has been briefed by scientists, and yet he still thinks he can't understand us. So in parallel to getting kids out in nature, I think scientists have an obligation to be more engaged with society, to be telling stories, not just spouting figures, to be talking about things that you care about, making scientific information accessible, learning how to be what I call bilingual. I think scientists need to learn the language of science, but we also need to learn the language of lay people. And that, in fact, is vitally important for us to be able to not only share what we know, but listen to society and engage more, make our collective journey one that is more likely to get us to the green and blue visions that I think we need.
Thank you very much, Jane.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. To describe our next speaker, the distinguished Professor Hugh Possingham, as a professor of mathematics and ecology entirely misses the point. In building the Applied Environmental Decision Analysis Center at Australia's University of Queensland, Hugh has not just integrated math and ecology, but he's found the union for math and ecology into a unique synthesis to produce what he once called applied theoreticians of conservation biology. Built to create smart science for wise decision, Hugh's group has developed new methods for quantifying decisions, including leading approaches to spatial planning of reserves that transform how marine protected areas were designed in Australia. His research has also had a major impact on land use government there, as well as throughout the rest of the world. Hugh's perspectives often challenge the way we think about conservation today. So today he confronts us with conundrums in protected policy management, whether we should expand or represent, restore or protect, manage or expand. Hugh, welcome.
Thanks a lot, Steve. And listening to those lovely talks this morning, I always think it'd be nice if I knew what I was doing. You've had a series of articulate, well thought out and well researched talks, and I think Steve throws me in there to be sort of bumbling and annoying as best I can. Fortuitously, I will speak so quickly and in such a strange accent you probably won't understand it. So the bumbling and annoying will maybe be hidden. You'll just think benign thoughts about me. But I will say some things, as Steve warned you, that you're not going to like. Certainly I hope to annoy everybody. If you're not annoyed, I'll give you your money back at the end of the talk. Because I think we do need to ask difficult questions, and what struck me last night about Steve's introduction to this whole conference was that the academia is the place where we can say things that are going to be unpopular. We can open questions that are going to pick at people's wounds and attack people's values and judgments, and that's why we're here, that's why we do it, things that many public servants, many members of the general public are unable to do. So if we don't do it, who isn't going to do it? And certainly that's what I'm going to do as much as possible. Let me just remind everybody that as a professor leading two large centres and a lab of 27 PhD students, I try and do as little as possible. They do all the work. If I say something smart, they did it. If I say something stupid, that was me. I'm going to race through some ideas, and what I'm really, the big idea in this, I suppose, is we've had a lot of theory in ecology, and that theory in ecology has been profound and important. But we don't really have a theory for conservation biology. The danger of conservation science is that it's a series of special cases. We need to understand the population genetics of this little flower that lives on the top of the hill. And so what we're trying to do in our group, other than solving a lot of very, very specific problems, as Steve pointed out, our software Marxan is used by 140 countries around the world to build most of the world's marine and terrestrial protected area systems. So we're happy to deliver tools that can be used in specific circumstances and solve particular problems. I spend 55 days a year sitting on government committees, working with NGOs, dealing with philanthropists on 13 different committees, sorting out their very specific problems. What I'm trying to do in our group, to a certain extent, is elevate the question up to some more grander theories about how we should do conservation. If you like, sort of like a macroeconomics of conservation science. And I don't know if it's going to work, and you can tell me later or not. And, you know, we've had this grand flowering of theory in ecology, and it's been wonderful, and people in this room, people we've heard this morning, have been the founders of some of that fundamental theory, particularly obviously the late Robert MacArthur. Foraging theory, patch use theory, all those things are not only brilliant, but they're also very useful. We've got a whole heap of information about species area curves, relationships between carrying capacities and means time to extinction. So this is all incredible stuff over a long period of time. But none of that involves economics and people. And of course, as we've heard several times this morning, if we're going to make decisions in the real world, we have to think about money and we have to think about people's values. Decision science is stuff we just steal from economists, and I know everybody thinks economists destroy the world. They don't destroy the world. They just advise the people who destroy the world. They're actually just providing the best advice they possibly can, and same with engineers. And they have a whole grab bag of tools called decision science, and that's what we've merged in with conservation. That's our thing. And that's what I'm going to talk about. So the SLOSS debate, arguably that single large or several smalls debate, maybe it was just too esoteric. That was an attempt to build some fundamental theory for conservation. It went terribly wrong because I think the answer became, should we have a single large or several small reserve? I think the answer was, it depends. So after 20 years, that was our answer. We've worked a bit on it. We have an answer. We think it's 6 or 7. 7's a much sexier number, so we'll probably go with that because it's a prime number. But the bottom line is it's either that or 1. And interestingly, in that case, we've developed a whole heap of theory that actually embraces uncertainty and deals with that and say, yes, you do need risk spreading. Again, arguably still not really that fundamentally useful for park design and management. So let's go to some of the things I think are going to be a bit more useful. And I would say, in a sense, generalisations haven't been working so well for us, and it's a little bit disappointing. And so that's what we're trying to do. So one of the questions we've just been tackling, and just recently got published in PLOS Biology, is really quite a fundamental question. Is prevention better than cure in conservation? And really an intriguing question. If you're in a region where there's a lot of free habitat, unprotected habitat, would you start restoring degraded land before you had protected all that could be protected? And my gut feeling when I first thought about that question was, of course not. Really, restoration is expensive. You not only have to protect the land, you will then have to restore it, and that takes a long time. It's not going to work. Why would you ever do that? So my conservation life has been generally devoted to habitat protection, stopping land clearing in Australia, and protection of land. So why start planting trees when they're disappearing at 100 times the rate? So we built some fundamental theory around that question. I won't go into the maths. It's very, very simple stuff. But the basic question is the world is divided in these simple rules between the stuff that is unprotected, the forested stuff, the protected stuff we're trying to restore, and stuff that's degraded and cleared. And we could put effort into one of those two things. We can either chew into the unprotected land and make it more protected, which is making more national parks and managing them well, or we could actually chew into the cleared area. Now, actually, probably the answer is a bit of both. Strangely enough, even though I never thought we should be strongly investing in restoration, the fact is the math proves that we strongly invest in restoration well before all the unprotected forest is protected. So I was wrong. Completely wrong. This is analysis done on Southeast Atlantic rainforest that shows the black line is the unprotected forest. That's declined rapidly. The red stuff is just habitat destruction that's been going on for a long period of time, taking it now down to a very small fraction. The math says that, in fact, we protect to a certain point, but we don't start restoring the blue line. The restoring starts well before the black line hits zero. The black line is the unprotected forest. And before that hits zero, it is optimal from a biodiversity perspective. And we've shown this not only for this forest, but for ecosystem services, for species diversity. So there are some simple rules here, and we've come up with some sort of simple rules of thumb that in some senses isn't meant to be applied under any specific circumstances, but is meant to be a bit like macroeconomic theory, just pointing out that the relative costs of those two activities, restoration versus protection, and the rates of the two fundamental landscape drivers, how fast restoration works and how fast habitat is lost, can be simply combined until you get a rule of thumb about when you should switch from protecting to restoring. And it doesn't happen when there's nothing left to protect. So that's been interesting. We still need to work on that. We think it's broad policy advice that we can roll out across the planet. But let's have a look at a couple of other questions where I'm not sure we actually have the answer yet. I'm going to tell you a bit about what we're trying to do now. One of the most interesting things, and we've actually heard a lot about this morning, is the issue of representation versus expansion. Well, we haven't heard a lot about representation, but I'm going to say representation is really the unsung issue in conservation. I think representative reserve systems are arguably more important than big reserve systems. And let me give you an example. This is Australia's marine reserve system, our network of marine protected areas, as Jane described. It's all the areas that are vaguely protected. The green stuff are our marine reserves. They actually haven't been formalised yet. We actually began this process in 1998. We had a vision under Senator Hill to get about 20% of all Australia's EEZ protected. So that protected area system is 2.5 million square kilometres. That's the size of Germany and France added together times 2. So it's a very big marine reserve system. The Great Barrier Reef Marine Park is part of that. That was incredibly well systematically designed. It used our software marks, and of about 70 ecoregion types, at least 20% of each is fully protected. And the whole system's only 33%. So at least 20% is in marine reserves. That is the most equitable marine reserve system anywhere on the planet, because they use the software. They lauds a great achievement, 2.5 million square kilometres, of which a third is marine reserves, the green stuff. So that's what, 0.6, 0.7, 0.8 million square kilometres of marine reserves. Just have a quick look at it. Do you think that's a representative reserve system? Let's just zoom in to a particular bit. This is an area that's vast. That's as big as the whole of Western United States, EEZ. And there's our lovely marine reserve system. There are the no-take areas. Let's see if I can work this technology. So these are the only marine reserves. This is 200 miles. This is hundreds of kilometres. Can you see something going on here that's a little bit distressing? We've done a wonderful job at conserving the abyssal plain. The abyssal plain, which is 3,000 or 4,000 metres deep and was under huge threat from I don't know. Things that live in... What lives in the abyssal plain, Jane? I don't know. Some colourless jelly. We've got a marine reserve system. 10 to 15% of the entire nation is marine reserves. And we have basically entire ecosystems, not just habitats, entire ecosystems, entire ecoregions that have no fully no-take marine reserve. So this is not good. And this is where people have chosen to expand. They're meeting those CBD targets like 10 and 17%, and they're not thinking about what they're getting. And then it's going to be very, very hard for me to go back, as I have on many occasions in many states of Australia, saying, your reserve system is not good enough, make it bigger. They say to me, you've got 15%, you've got 20%, we meet the CBD targets. But you're missing half the habitat types. Too bad, we can't look after what you've got. So think carefully before you say expand, expand, expand. It may work here, in a country that's well resourced. We've got 20 million people living in a continent the size of the United States. So, we've got that system, it's not very good. So we've asked some even more controversial questions in Australia, which has a very big terrestrial reserve system. Maybe, if we really want to have a representative reserve system, we may have to sell some of our reserves. We would covenant them before we sold them, but we just can't look after it. Queensland has a huge reserve. South Australia has a reserve system that's 20% of the state, twice the size of Belgium, and has 80 park rangers. 80 park rangers are looking after twice the size of Belgium. And the neighbouring pastoral properties are often in better condition than the protected areas. Of course, I would love to multiply the protected area budget by 10. I'd love to do that. I've tried to do that. It hasn't happened. So we need more metrics, and we just can't think of expanding all the time. Now, this is the killer slide, published in 2011. We looked at all the world and looked at all the countries, and we ranked the countries by how representative, how large a reserve system is. And we've taken every country in the world, and the United States, I think at that point, had about 18% protected on the land, 17 or 18% is in the top quartile. So tick in the top quartile of all countries in terms of percentage protected. Australia's not, China's not so good at all at that point in time. So what happens now when you look carefully at the issue of how representative that is? So we invented a new metric called protection equality, which we stole from The Economist, the Gini coefficient, which talks about equality in income. We just took that and applied it to equality in ecosystems. Let's assume all ecosystems are equal. We're in communist Berkeley, we can say that. And so they're all equal, they should be all equally represented. And how well do we score them? Well, this country and Canada, some of these countries that have big reserve systems have highly inequitable reserve systems. You might say that's not our fault, the prairies were cleared before we got there. I agree. Okay, it makes it very difficult when you have highly arable land that is destroyed. But China's still terrible, but Australia's just come ahead of you. That's the whole point of this slide, actually. But this is a problem. And just saying we want more and more and more, Botswana's the best place in the world, I might say. So go to Botswana, spend your money on ecotourism, because they have a big reserve system that is also equitable. They got green on both counts. Okay, so we've got a new metric, and I would like you to think now more about, rather than us having CBD targets, 10%, 70%, let's have protection equality targets. It's the quality that matters. And of course, quality isn't all just about representation. And there's probably some of the things I might have said before, this composite metric. We now need to work out, where is it best to expand? We can expand, but we've got to expand in a smart way to places we can manage and improve representation rather than just expanding anything we can get. And that leads on to a whole series of other questions we're interested in answering. And, again, I've already mentioned the fact that we are not managing our reserve system in Australia very well. We did an analysis of all the needs of our 1,760 listed species in Australia, and we worked out that if we had an extra lazy $10 million, we should invest it in managing the parks we have better, not expanding the park system. In fact, if we had a lazy $100 million, we would invest it in managing the parks we have better, not expanding the parks. And then there's all these other fundamental dichotomies that I still think we haven't solved. We really need to get these things sorted out. We need to provide broad policy advice for lots of countries, and not just our own countries, which have an army of conservation biologists, but we have countries like Brazil, Colombia, countries all through Africa that are already building and arguing about where their protected areas should go and what it should be. And then, if I haven't annoyed all of you, is there anybody unannoyed? Maybe not. Put your hand up. Monitoring. Everybody, if you ask a scientist, should we spend more money on monitoring, they'll say yes. Of course they should. And I think monitoring's wonderful, particularly if it's done by citizen scientists. I run a big citizen science group in Australia, coupled up with eBird Aramea. But monitoring costs money. And in Australia, we've found that many organisations doing on-the-ground work are spending too much of their money monitoring, getting data that nobody analyses, nobody stores, and never informs a decision. So think twice about advising about monitoring. There is an optimal amount of your budget you should spend monitoring. There's an optimal amount of your budget you should spend management. And some things maybe aren't worth monitoring. Dare I say that? You shouldn't necessarily monitor everything. And we've written now a series of papers about when is it best to monitor. In some cases, we're not monitoring enough. But don't just always assume that monitoring is the be-all and end-all of life. And these fundamental questions, which are almost like attacking people's religious beliefs, I think, if you're talking about scientists. Imagine telling a scientist not to monitor. We really have to address them and we need to come up with some answers. So our future is coming up with simple rules that can inform these broad policy decisions. I'm tempted to call it conservanomics. If you Google that, you get this, I think it's conservative economics in Texas, so it's probably not the best name in the world, but I'm well aware that unless you invent a name, then you're never going to be a famous scientist, so I thought I should, even though it's a silly name. Might I end by saying that I agree with all the points about communication, Jane, E.O. Wilson, they've all said these things very well. We have a monthly magazine that we have a science writer produce for our centres, and it goes out to managers and politicians and decision makers. And probably this is far more important than anything I've said or anything I've done. It's getting things out, and that's, if you want to see what we're doing, a Google decision point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugh. That was annoying.
Oh, good. Thank you.
And enjoyable. Thank you very much. I don't think anybody's going to have to get a refund. But I did want to ask you, you have interfaced a lot with, well, let me ask you about your last point, citizen science and monitoring. Have you found the right way to bring those two together into decision making yet?
I think in some sense it's the citizen science stuff, which we partnered up with eBird, and we brought together Australian organisations and eBird into a bigger partnership because we use the machinery of Cornell, which is incredible. Arguably, I'd say not. I think the data's there. We've got an interesting method called list length analysis, which just allows you to determine trends in bird diversity and species just looking at bird lists. So it's a really interesting technology, so you don't have to have professional time counts. But what I like most about it is just the engagement. The engagement is crucial, and that's just getting so many people, more and more people out, bird watching, counting things, watching things. If you count something, you think about it, people taking photographs, you can post pictures. And the fact that the government loves us doing it. So our centres now are asked to spend 20% of our money on engagement.
And they're beautiful places to go to, right? That's right. So how would you envision doing that same kind of attractiveness in a restoration park? A place that starts as a place maybe you don't really want to go to.
Yeah, I think getting people to go back to the same place time and time again is interesting. So I've been doing a monthly count of birds in the suburbs near me every month for 11 years, unfailingly. And I just think when you keep counting the same things in the same place, you learn so much. And you see things, nothing rare, nothing particularly outrageous, but getting people to watch their patch and record that and talk about it is to me, is critical. Because we're not going to have lots of money for transporting. I mean, Australia has huge gaps in knowledge in the middle of Australia, but the middle of Australia in the middle of summer is not somewhere where you go bird watching usually. So we're going to struggle to fill those gaps, but I think, the engagement is crucial. Bird watching in cities is great.
Yeah. That's great. Our National Park Service has this mission to preserve unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values. And so your suggestions about thinking about restoration ecology parks are really interesting. But how do you see that fitting with that mission of preserve unimpaired?
Yeah, I mean, I would say Australia conservation ethic is very similar to this country. We sort of yearn for the pre-invasion days, and when I grew up, I remember founding the Flora and Fauna Society of Adelaide Plains, and there were 7.5 hectares in an entire city that was pristine vegetation. There were 750 species of plants once there, there are now 500, and all those 500 species of plants were crammed into 7.5 hectares across an entire city. And in the end, I used to run around finding seed from less than 3 kilometres away to plant a tiny piece of land this big with a few grasses. I think it's a museum. You know, they're not functional ecosystems. And so we've got to embrace creating ecosystems that are actually not going to be particularly natural. But, you know, as a bird watcher, I also noticed that birds don't care often where the plant came from. In Brisbane, we've been studying bush care groups who go in and they rip out all the weeds and they wipe out 20% of the small bird diversity, ripping out all the weeds. So I think I embrace some issues in very disturbed landscapes, and I've started to convert to a more European view in these heavily disturbed landscapes that these things have value. You can even get rare and threatened species in those landscapes. Of course, the park system has to be the fundamental core of our conservation efforts.
Great. And we have one question from the audience to finish us up. What exactly is better management? How does one manage better?
Good question. I mean, somebody said it earlier, it's not managers making a bad decision, it's just complete lack of resources in Australia. I mean, they're dealing with feral predators like cats. Has anybody tried to wipe out cats from a park in Australia? It is almost impossible. We don't have a bait that they'll take. They're sneaky and difficult to shoot. We're overrun with ferals and weeds, basically. And actually, Australians don't mind shooting cats. I mean, the Australian entire public is fully on board with destroying ferals at wholesale. But just no resources to do such things. It's extremely difficult. The weed problem's enormous, and fire management is contentious, difficult, just as it is in this country. So we have about the 10th of the resources that the park managers need, and then of course they have more and more forms to fill out every year as well, and more visitors to look after in strange ways. So I think our park service is, to be honest, on its knees most of the time.
Well, you've brought us to our knees. Thank you very much, Hugh. Perfect. Thank you. All right. We're going to switch gears here for just a minute. Reposition the stage while I introduce Holly Doremus. You can come forward here, Holly. Maybe we're going to have a strategic conversation now about aspects of mission and of our national parks. And I'll turn it over to Holly to kind of introduce the general topic while we get the stage reset. We'll ask our distinguished panelists to please come forward, please.
So it's a great pleasure for me to have the opportunity to host the first of 3 strategic conversations that we're going to include in this program. This one features a distinguished and diverse set of discussants. Their full bios are in the program, but in the interest of devoting as much time as possible to the conversation, I'm just going to begin by asking each of them to tell us their name, title, and affiliation, and then I will moderate a conversation among them with questions from me and also hopefully from the audience.
it on? Got it. Okay. How do I do that?
Nope. There you go.
All right, now I got it.
All right.
I'm Denis Galvin. I work for the National Park Service for 38 years, starting here at Sequoia more than 50 years ago, more than most of you were born. And I ended my career as Deputy Director of the National Park Service in Washington.
Francis.
Hi everyone, my name is Frances Roberts-Gregory. I'm a second-year Ph.D. student here at UC Berkeley in ESPM.
I'm George Miller, newly retired member of Congress after 40 years and serving 30 of those years on the Natural Resources Committee in the House of Representatives. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, let's get down to our conversation. Congressman Miller, let me start with you. In your view, what is or are the most important missions of the National Park System, and how's that changed over the last 100 years, and how do you think it might change in the next 100?
In 30 seconds.
30 seconds. We'll give you 45.
I think the mission is changed dramatically in magnitude, if not in purpose. But to me, it's a continued challenge of presenting this incredibly complex platform that we call our national park systems, and how do you recognize the complexity of the resources and the complexity of the interface with that system, with the American public, that holds those parks in very high esteem. They look at them as authoritative, how maybe public lands should be managed, and they transfer a huge amount of culture across generations. When we come up with plans to revise the operations of national parks, we bump into generational cultural and habits and traditions and families that probably dominate an incredible chunk of that debate. And so to continue to protect, to preserve, to open greater access, that's the challenge. This is an incredibly complex platform. You might not have designed it this way in the very beginning, but that's what it is today in a growing complexity within our society.
Ms. Gregory, did you want to say anything about the mission of the parks today and tomorrow, yesterday?
Right. I think like you stated, the national park system is very complex. And I think that in order to engage a more diverse public in the future, we have to actually talk about the diverse histories and stories and narratives that have existed in the past and also exist in the present. So I think that a lot of times we just have to uncover what's already there and bring voice to understandings of the world and identifications with the National Park Service that previously have been underdocumented.
And Mr. Galvin?
Often the mission of the Park Service is simply the restatement of the Act of August 25th, 1916. And actually there are dozens of pieces of legislation that give the Park Service other missions. Land and Water Conservation Fund, National Environmental Protection Act, et cetera. So there actually is officially a second sentence to the mission, and it says, the National Park Service cooperates with partners to extend the benefits of natural and cultural resource conservation and outdoor recreation throughout this country and the world. And in thinking about those two sentences, the first to conserve the scenery and the second to cooperate, and in thinking about time and changes in time, I think it's arguably in the next 100 years, the second sentence may be more important than the first, because what's happened over the last 100, 150 years is you take a place like Yellowstone, it's out there all alone. The forces that act on Yellowstone 100 or 150 years ago are enormously different than the forces that act on it today. Many of the forces, perhaps the most important forces on Yellowstone or Gettysburg or Cape Cod or Cape Hatteras, come from outside the boundaries of the parks. And several of the early speakers mentioned, last night, these are islands in a very complex matrix, so that these authorities and mission that the Park Service has to cooperate with people outside the parks becomes important not only for people to build conservation in their own communities, which is very important, but it's also important to protect the park system itself.
Well, let me follow up on that then. And as you've noted, national parks are necessarily embedded in a larger landscape. And that can bring both spillover benefits, they're important economic engines for the communities around them, and also spillover costs, such as bison, which move out of Yellowstone National Park and are perceived at least to be a source of disease for livestock. How should the neighborhood of the parks influence their management? Or I might put that question a little bit differently and ask, who are our national parks for? Should local communities have a special voice in their management? And if so, what should that look like? Should there be special efforts to connect local communities with their parks, and how can that be done? Frances, you want to start us off?
Sure. Well, I definitely think it's very important that the, I guess you would say, local demographics of a park are influenced by the management strategies pursued by park rangers and park officials. I think too often in the past, there's been a particular idea of who should enjoy a park, what enjoyment of a park should look like of a particular, let's say, site. And I think we have to take into account that different people have different ways of enjoying even the so-called wilderness or these areas that we want to protect. So I think that's really important to take into account what local communities want, and not to just rely upon this, I guess, unidirectional model of communication, and actually have conversations with individuals. And I guess someone else mentioned earlier, learning to be bilingual or trilingual, not just in terms of what we think of as, I guess, languages, but just different ways of viewing the world or viewing what is science.
Denis?
You had to bring up bison. Sometime in the mid-90s, Secretary Babbitt called me up to his office about 6 o'clock at night and said, "I want you to go out to Yellowstone and stop the slaughter." We were on network television every night. One of the biologists said, "Shooting bison's like shooting a sofa." Also very easy to televise. And I think the thing I would like to say about the Bison Management Plan, which I was deeply involved in, is it's one of the, and it goes to your, who are parks for? In that instance, we probably had 65,000 comments from around the world on bison. And 64,900 of them were for the bison. And about 100 of them, a few ranchers around Wyoming, the governor of Montana, were much more influential in the management of bison than the 64,900 people who said, yeah, save the bison at all costs. And the science was pretty clear that brucellosis didn't really threaten cattle outside the parks. Not entirely clear, but probably 95% clear. For one thing, there were no cattle around the park when the bison went out. So then the question is, how long does the brucella last? Blah, 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 blah. But it really, the science influenced our decision, but as many people said earlier this morning, it's a policy decision, and you got to make trade-offs. And the solution we came up with is a very imperfect solution. We're still killing bison outside the park, but it's getting better. I mean, one of the things we said was, we're going to start intensive management when there are 2,900. Well, now there are 4,500, so at least there are more bison. The state has become more open to accepting bison outside the park, working their way up to a place called Yankee Jim Canyon. So that particular, the two things about that. One is local people tend to have much more influence on park decisions than a national or international constituency. And the second thing is science influences policy, but it doesn't set policy. Mr. Chairman.
Well, I think if you start to think about the parks in this day and age as islands, we're doomed. Certainly the parks are doomed. I mean, I think there's rings of intensity and there's rings of ownership to some extent of those parks, and obviously the communities and the activities around the park have much more concern about the operation of those parks and the planning, the development of those parks. But that's the progression. I mean, we would love to have, we didn't need the buffers when we created the parks, and now we look at the impacts of population and the rest of that. But I think also you have to understand that those parks have to run, when you look at the state of California, knowledge and awareness of the parks has to run all the way to South Central LA and back to Kings Canyon Park, or to Sequoia, or to Yosemite. In fact, the National Park System has to think of East Bay Regional Parks as a farm club for how people conduct themselves outdoor, how they interact with one another. If you walk on the great trails of the East Bay Regional Parks, it's the bikes versus the horses versus the dogs versus the people versus the runners, and it happens every day. But you have the same kind of complexity inside of the national parks. The stakes may be somewhat higher, and they're somewhat more overwhelmed for 3 months of the year. But I think you have to think about operating them in that system. And I would say that the role of science in that process is to completely revising and continuously revising the operation plan, if you will, so we can do the least amount of harm that we can and hopefully provide, in fact, for the positive recovery of those parks. It's very hard when you look at Yosemite Valley in July and think, how can you, how are you going to do this? But the fact of the matter is, working with park personnel and having them fully informed in the design of science, in the implementation of science, with the results of science, they can start to think about how they refigure the parks. We have institutions within those parks that are cherished and is historical, but they're also threatening to the parks. So the question is, can you keep the tradition? Can you diminish the adverse impact on cultural memories, and at the same time allow for a lighter footprint of many of those activities in these big iconic parks in the system? That's, to me, that's the challenge there.
Given what we've heard this morning, I want to make sure we address the question of whether we should add to our park system, and if so, in what ways. But before we get there, I want to get your thoughts on what's distinctive about the national park system and what should be distinctive as opposed to the many other kinds of protected or partially protected lands that we have, ranging from the local level, including some private lands, state lands, other sorts of federal lands. What's distinctive, Denis?
Well, a couple of thoughts. One is the mandate of going back to the Organic Act, the parks are to preserve everything. And we make I'm always correcting text when they get to the word wildlife in the Organic Act, because in the original act, it's 2 words, wildlife. So wildlife, one word is, elk, bison. The Park Service has always interpreted wildlife as every living thing in the park. So that's one distinction. Not like Fish and Wildlife Service that has the mission to protect particular species, not like the Forest Service that does multiple use. The other thing, and we were talking about this at breakfast this morning, is the interpretive and education programs of the Park Service are more extensive. That's not to say the other agencies don't have it, but they're certainly more extensive, longer history. I worked with Wayne Bryant at Sequoia. Harold Bryant was his father. And they are real resources. They're real resources for science and conservation. So interpretation, education, and preserve everything.
George?
Well, I think that's all part of it. For the last 30 years, I've walked back and forth across the tops of Kings Canyon, Sequoia, and Yosemite. And over those years, I picked up a lot of cowboys, wranglers, sawyers, trail crews, convicts, all engaged in the park and with all of the professional park personnel. And to sit around that campfire and have these people join you and discuss the complexity of the park and the challenges of the mission, and in some cases where they would admit that they may be flying blind because they really don't know the impact of the changes that they might have to make. That's harder to do today with all of the requirements on you. But the fact is, again, trying to figure out how to inform them about these decisions in the operations of the parks. I think they are different, and I think Americans probably want them treated somewhat differently. But yet, we have to constantly decide whether they're survivable in that environment. And is there a design on some of the assets that are in those parks? Think of California in the drought, and then wild and scenic rivers. People say, oh, maybe we ought to go back to dam building. It didn't do much for this drought, but anyway, it's the beginning. So I think that continuous effort, and I think the point of this conference is that science has a huge contribution to make in terms of, obviously, I guess it's bad to say science for science sake, but with all due respect, that's science for science sake. It took us to the next generation of a lot of things. But also the application in the administering and the enjoyment of the parks, I think, is absolutely critically, because a lot of it we've done by the seat of our pants. We've made huge mistakes that we've come back to try and repair in the administration of the parks. But I also would say I would like to continue providing a quilt of protective environments around those parks, so that the parks have more flexibility, the bison have more flexibility in their survival and their participation.
Frances, anything you'd like to add?
I guess I would just add, throughout my life, I've visited local parks, state parks, national parks. I've traveled to parks internationally, and I find that there's things that I enjoy about all of these different types of parks, and obviously there's something we consider very sacred about our national parks, but I would maybe push back against that and say that I think that there's something to be gained from the parks that perhaps don't have as many resources and perhaps are valuable to a certain demographic of people that might not be seen as valuable to others. For example, urban parks. I don't think urban parks get as much attention as they probably deserve, and not all of them are classified as national parks.
So then very quickly, should we be adding to the system, either in terms of new units or new lands? We heard from E.O. Wilson that we need to protect much more of the globe, from Jane Lubchenco that we need to protect much more of the seas, but then from Hugh Possingham, some skepticism about whether what we need is to protect more or to protect better. What do you think about adding to the national park system? George, you want to start us out?
I voted for them all. I think in many ways, in some areas where there's a lot of different attitudes about public ownership of the lands and the interface of public ownership and private ownership, and even the interface culturally with the idea that this is going to be a federally administered area in some fashion. I think very often what you find is that the creation of the park, I'm not sure this is a proper public purpose, but I found politically, the creation of the park is like an icebreaker in the spring. It opens the path for a lot of other good things to happen in that geographic area. And I think it's very important in terms of the long-term vision of saving those assets, whether from the perspective of Professor Wilson or for the immediate idea that we can spend the weekend there. I mean, those are kind of competing views. So I think, some of the parks that are some of the areas waiting to be designation should be given absolute serious consideration. Not, the first guy's got the best, right? There's El Capitan, and there's Half Dome, and then there's the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, and then there's the Grand Canyon. You're not going to find another Grand Canyon, but you can find a lot of important areas that should be tried to be protected. And if it's sort of like if we're just going to have the elite schools, then a lot of people are going to get left out. So there's others that rise to the same mission, the same purpose, and the same protection. And I think that we should strive to include them.
Denis, 30 seconds.
Let me just say that a lot of people are going to get left out. I've been on 2 groups looking at the future of the park system in the last 5 years. And yes, there is opportunity for robust growth. Just thinking about people, there are 100 acres of national park for every person in Alaska. There are 1 million people in Illinois for every acre of national park in Illinois. And there's they're going to be different kinds of parks. They're going to be parks like the Upper Mississippi, where you got 72-mile river corridor, and the Park Service only owns 75 acres. But it coordinates the planning in that corridor. So we're not going to be building Yellowstones, but there's ample opportunity for growth in both the natural and cultural sphere.
All right, I think we have time for one more quick round of responses. So what's the single biggest management challenge for the national parks in the next 100 years, in your view? Francis, you want to tackle that very easy question?
Okay, start off with me. I think really engaging the public. A lot of people have talked about it, and also resources, making sure there's enough resources for the parks in the future. I think we talk about engagement, but we don't actually implement it. We rely upon some of the same methods of talking about what is science and why people should be involved without really, and we're not being effective. I think that if you want to reach changing demographics in America, you have to, also change yourself. Like, you want perhaps an individual who's never thought about parks to get involved. You yourself might have to get involved in, let's say, human rights issues or social justice issues that you've never thought about. So I think we need to cut down these binaries between what is science, what is not, what is a citizen, or the public versus the government or science, and really just all change ourselves, not just saying the public needs to change.
Absolutely, agree with that completely. In fact, I think one of the great opportunities for science is the opportunity for citizens to engage science in national parks, not to make them scientists, but to participate. You think about things like the theory of evolution. Many people in this country do not support the theory of evolution. You go to a place like Grand Canyon, it hits you in the face. Let me just finish with a quote from a panel that Dr. Wilson was on. John Hope Franklin was the chair. By caring for the parks and conveying the park ethic, we care for ourselves and act on behalf of the future. The larger purpose of this mission is to build a citizenry that is committed to conserving its heritage and its home on Earth. That's the opportunity for parks. Parks can't do it by itself, but can it move the citizenry to protect their community and the planet?
George, we'll give you the last one.
I think the challenge is climate, because I think climate, not only the direct impact on the parks. If you go to the iconic parks on the Canadian-American border, we're building freeway overpasses for bears and elks and others, and tunnels for those who want a closed environment. So they're already starting to migrate and move. And if you go to look at the glacier and Glacier Park, it's a long hike. It's not leaning over the edges. So I think it is climate, but climate's also going to have an impact on outside of the park that's going to conceivably disturb populations, and while it has to be, I think, managed in that context, it's not just in the valley of the park, in the center of the park, the canyon of the park. I think climate is going to be a huge challenge in the general national park ecosystem, which is much larger, of course, than the park.
Well, obviously, we could talk much more about these issues. Hopefully, we'll come back to some of these themes this afternoon and tomorrow, but please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you. We'll see you all at 1:15 promptly.